Coming up in this week's video, I want to address a very common mistake that people often make when taking photos. I want to show you how you can avoid it so you can take better, sharper images. Plus, as usual, tips, camera settings and more. Welcome to the Photo Genius channel. If you want to be a creative photographer, then you need to understand and be able to take advantage of the many different features available in your camera, such as, for example, shutter speed. Now, by choosing the right shutter speed, you can choose whether to freeze motion or intentionally blur subjects to create a feeling of motion, speed, or maybe direction of travel. Hi, I'm Paul from Photo Genius. I'm a photographer who's been teaching photography for over 16 years here in Brisbane. I run photography courses and workshops and have also been creating video tutorials just like this one for over 8 years. Please consider subscribing so you don't miss out on future videos, and of course if you enjoy this video, please support my channel by giving it a like. It really means a lot and it helps the videos get noticed. Adjusting the shutter speed on a camera is a very effective way of controlling light, but can also be used as a creative tool if you're taking a photo of a moving subject or there are elements of movement in your composition. Now, a common mistake that I often see people making, particularly if using one of the camera's priority modes, is simply not paying attention to the camera's shutter speed. So yesterday I had some free time and I went for a walk along the bay to take some photos. I didn't want to carry a tripod around, so all of my shots were handheld, and for that reason I was being very careful not to go too slow with the shutter speed. Let me show you why. Now, this is a recording straight from the camera, and despite what it may look like, I am trying my very best to keep the camera steady, but the longer telephoto lens is making it really difficult, particularly on a windy day on the coast. So here's an image taken using a fast shutter speed. As you can see, the image is sharp and detailed, but here's the very same subject shot with a slower shutter speed, and as you can see, the image is blurry. Now, this has nothing to do with focusing, this is simply camera shake. Slowing the shutter down means that it is open for longer, and I was unable to keep the camera steady between the shutter opening and closing again. Now, if you're thinking, okay then, just use a tripod, yes, you're absolutely right, a tripod will make a big difference. But sometimes you might want to travel light and not have to carry a tripod around. And some of you watching may not even have a tripod. And that's why I'm making this video. The solution to this problem is actually easy. Know your limits. Work out what is the slowest shutter speed that you can use before camera shake starts to become a real problem. And then ideally try to stay above it. But how do you know what your limit is? Let me show you. To avoid blurry images, we can use a basic formula. We start with the focal length of the lens and then multiply it by the crop factor of the camera sensor. Now, this equals the minimum shutter speed we should be using to avoid camera shake. So as an example, let's say we are using a telephoto lens set to 200mm on a Canon Rebel T7 1500D. The crop factor for that particular camera is 1.6. So 200 times 1.6 equals 320. If we now turn this number into a fraction, we now know that we need to set the shutter speed to 1/320th of a second minimum, but preferably, and if we can, faster would be better. Now, this calculation will vary depending on the camera and lens you're using, so make sure you stick around because in just a moment I'm going to run through the numbers again for some of the most common camera types, including Canon, Nikon, Fujifilm, Sony Olympus and even Pentax. So to put the math to the test, I went back down to the bay a little later in the day to take some shots using my Nikon ZFC and a 50 to 250mm telephoto lens. As you can see, once again, trying to keep a long telephoto lens steady is extremely difficult. So taking the focal length of the lens and multiplying it by the crop factor for the Nikon ZFC, I then had my minimum shutter speed and now knew how low I could go. Using this method, I was able to get a few good images. but of course not following the recommended minimum shutter speed and using the camera handheld often leads to disaster, as you can see here. Of course, with the pelicans being a moving subject, the chances of a blurry image increases. So I also did some testing using a static non-moving subject. Here you can see just how much my hand movements are exaggerated when I extend the lens from 50mm to 250mm. Now for this first shot, 1/500th of a second puts me safely above the minimum recommended shutter speed, and the result is a sharp image. Same again at 1/400th of a second, and at 1/320th of a second, again I feel the image looks acceptably sharp. But at 1/250th of a second, if we zoom in, there is already noticeable blur. And of course, this only gets worse as I continue to slow the shutter down. So next, as promised, let's run through the numbers again, this time for some different camera types. And make sure you stick around, because in a moment I want to talk about image stabilization. The crop factor is a ratio based on the size of the camera sensor compared to 35mm film. Full frame cameras have a ratio of 1 because the sensor is the same size as a single 35mm film frame. Smaller sensors are referred to as cropped, and the crop factor is based on how much smaller the sensor is, with the popular APS-C sensor having a crop factor of 1.5. This is used by Nikon, Fujifilm, Sony and Pentax. Canon use a slightly smaller sensor with a crop factor of 1.6, and Micro Four Thirds sensors found in Olympus and Panasonic cameras use an even smaller sensor with a crop factor of 2. So let's take a full frame camera like the Nikon Z6. Using a 200mm telephoto lens, the calculation is of course very easy, as 200 times 1 is of course 200, so a shutter speed of 1/200th of a second should do the trick, but remember, faster is often better. Now the same focal length on the Canon T7, for example, with a crop factor of 1.6 will give different results, because 200 times 1.6 is 320. So now the shutter speed needs to be 1/320th of a second or higher. And of course, if you're using a Micro Four Thirds camera, you have no excuses. The calculation is very easy. 200 times 2 equals 400. So you've guessed it, the shutter speed would need to be at 1/400th of a second or higher if using the camera handheld. Now a reminder that this rule does not apply if you're using a tripod. So as you can see, how slow can you go is based on the type of camera and the focal length of the lens you're using at the time. But what about if you're using a camera or lens that has image stabilization? Well, in that case, you should be able to slow the shutter down even more and still get a sharp image, even using the camera handheld. I put this to the test too. Let me show you. Now the Nikon ZFC does not have in-body stabilization, but the 50 to 250mm lens I was using does have vibration reduction, and the results exceeded my expectations. So here's a side-by-side comparison, clearly showing what a huge difference the VR makes when using the camera handheld on a windy afternoon. Starting with a shutter speed of 1/500 and 1/400th of a second, the subject looks sharp as expected. At 1/320th of a second, a reminder that this is the slowest recommended shutter speed based on this camera and lens combination. Just as before, I continue to slow the shutter speed down, but with vibration reduction turned on, I was still getting sharp images all the way down to 1/50th of a second. In fact, if I enlarge the image, you can clearly see a sticker on the sign dated 2014. Now that's really impressive, particularly if we compare it to the earlier image taken with the same shutter speed but no vibration reduction. So when it comes to using a camera handheld, and particularly if you're using a longer focal length lens, there are a few factors that will need to be considered, such as image stabilization, how steady your hands are, and how long the lens is. My advice is to do the maths, calculate what is the lowest or slowest shutter speed that you should use, and then go and do some test shots. If you have more than one lens, see how different lenses and adjusting the zoom affects your ability to hold the camera steady. Take advantage of image stabilization if you have it, and once you've got a feel for how low you can go, simply make a note of that number and then aim to keep your shutter speed at it, or better still, above that number, and your images will look the better for it. So I really hope you've enjoyed this week's video and you picked up some cool tips. If you did, please consider hitting the like button because it really helps the videos get noticed. That helps the channel grow. If you want to see more from me, you know what to do. The subscribe button is also somewhere down there. That is about it, other than to say many thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again sometime soon. See ya. Bye.